Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. We may have become inured to the homeless adults sleeping on the street or asking for change. It's the face of homelessness we are sadly used to seeing. But there is another homeless population, larger and not as obvious. These are the homeless children. There are over 80,000 homeless students in New York City public schools, and their numbers continue to grow. Today, Jennifer Erb-Downward of the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness joins me to discuss the myriad obstacles and disparities these students face and what we can do to reverse the disturbing effects of homelessness on children's education. My guest today is Jennifer Erb-Downward, Principal Policy Analyst for the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness. Welcome to EdCast.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda.
What is ICPH and what does it do?
Sure. ICPH is an independent and nonprofit policy and research organization that focuses on family homelessness with a particular emphasis on what's happening to children who are homeless.
You know, I gave a rough figure about how many homeless children there were when we opened the program. How many homeless children are there?
In school year 2013-14, there were 84,000 children who are homeless in New York City public schools, not including charter schools. So if you think about having all those children in one place together, that would be roughly the size of the population of Trenton, New Jersey.
Wow, that's quite a lot of children. Have we seen an escalation in the numbers of homeless children over the years?
Yes. In the last 4 years, there's been a 25% increase in homeless students overall. And if you look at those numbers, what you see is the largest increase has been among doubled up students. That's increased by 63%. And those are students who are living with other families as a result of economic hardship or loss of housing.
So where do the homeless children live? So some of them now you're saying are living with other families. Where else do they live?
So by the educational definition of homelessness, you have some students who are living in shelter, and these are the students you hear most about in the news. So you'll hear about 23,000 students living in shelter every night. If you look at this educationally, over the year-long period, you have about 28,000 students who are living in shelter. And then you have another 49,000 students who are living doubled up in some sort of temporary, unstable situation with another family due to economic hardship. And then there are roughly another 7,000 students who are living either in hotel and motels for pay every night, paying for a hotel and motel, or in some other unspecified location, such as a car or an abandoned building. So there are a lot of different situations that children who are homeless are staying in.
Who are the homeless children? Do we know their ethnicities and who they are?
Well, homeless children are across the city. So any child can be homeless, and I think that's really important to remember. There's homelessness in every single school district in New York City. What we do see, though, is that the majority of homeless students are disproportionately African American and Latino. About 51% of students who are homeless were Hispanic, and it's about 86% were combined minority groups.
So that's a disproportionate amount for sure. Of the living arrangements that you described, which ones does your research show pose the greatest risk for children? Really, across homelessness itself was the greatest risk for children. We looked at students and their outcomes by poverty and housing status, and what we found was using free or reduced price lunch as a proxy for low-income status. We found that on every educational indicator that homeless students were struggling the most. So you'll see this, for example, in dropout rates. If you look at homeless students who've experienced homelessness at any point during their 4 years, 20% of them dropped out of high school. Compared. Okay, so there really is a big. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay.
There's a big effect on their education.
Huge impact on their education.
Now, for how long? How long are students homeless? Let's take a look at one of the slides that you sent. Tell me how long students tend to be homeless.
So homelessness among students, one thing that was really shocking in our report was that students were homeless, the majority of students were homeless for more than 1 year. So you had 2/3 of students who were experiencing homelessness for over a year of time.
So that's a long time to be homeless.
Being homeless ever is a long time to be homeless, but then thinking about the educational impact and the social impact on a child when they are experiencing housing instability, either over multiple years or multiple times in the course of 4 years, really is just heartbreaking.
Why do you think we have this big surge now in homelessness?
Homelessness is a very complex issue. So there are a lot of different reasons why that's taking place. But one thing I think that's telling is that the largest increase in homelessness is among doubled up students. So you see this growth in doubled up students and students experiencing housing instability. And it's not just in shelter.
Mm-hmm. You did an analysis of homelessness in students by grade. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at that for a minute. That was an interesting graphic, I thought. Let's take a look. Okay, here it is up here. The number of homeless students by grade. Yeah. What can you tell us? What do the numbers show us?
Well, I think the most striking thing that the number shows us is that you have roughly 1/3 of students who are experiencing homelessness before 3rd grade, and that's when the standard tests begin, the 3rd through 8th grade math tests. So there are a lot of students who are experiencing homelessness at a very young age, and they're probably not being identified in terms of how they might be struggling, because some of those first indicators of where we really see some of the educational impacts are taking place in those 3rd through 8th grade test scores, where we see just 17% of homeless students being grade proficient at math, and just 13% who are grade proficient in English.
And those early years are the pivotal ones for students to get the foundation for the skills that they will need as they move on. So yes. I can see that really is a very disturbing number. Now, why do the numbers drop off a bit? When you look at that chart again, you see again a big number in kindergarten, 1st grade, then it goes up again in 9th grade. What happens from those early grades as the students move to high school?
Sure. Well, one thing that we know is that overall homelessness is a young issue. So if you were to look at the shelter population, what you would see is that the largest number of children are actually ages 0 through 5. So that is always the largest group of children that you'll see. So in general, when you look at that chart, you'll see that the peak is really in those younger years, in kindergarten, 1st grade, and then it starts going down. And then what happens in high school is really a sort of foreshadowing of students dropping out, that 20% dropout rate that we see. Yes. You see that if you were to smooth out that curve there in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it would pretty much follow the same curve of students, fewer students being homeless as they got older. But what you see is there are a lot of students who are homeless who are suffering from becoming undercredited and overaged, and then at a greater risk of dropping out of school.
I know there was a news story maybe today even about teenagers, and another kind of hidden group that we don't often think about, students who are teens and people in their early 20s. So there seems to be a lot going on. When you look at the city, and we look at the school districts, we have another graphic to look at this for a minute. Can you tell me which schools, districts, neighborhoods have the most homeless children?
Sure, and this is a really interesting thing to look at. So if you look at the map that is over here, you'll see the areas in red really highlight where there's the largest proportion of students who are homeless. So areas that will jump out are going to be in the Bronx, in District 9 and 10, the Concourse Highbridge area of the Bronx, and then also actually where we are today in the Kingsbridge, Fordham University Heights
this
area.
This is another big homeless student area.
Yes, so those are some of the areas that really stand out in terms of the proportion of students who are homeless. There, in those areas, you have about 1 in 5 students who are homeless, about 18% of the students. But then when you also, one thing that's interesting to think about is both the proportion of students who are homeless, but then also the number of students who are homeless. Because in some districts, like for example in District 2, there's a low proportion of students who are homeless, but there are over 2,000 students who are homeless in that district. And so the reason this kind of information is helpful from a policy perspective is that you can start to think about what types of different programs you would need to have in order to reach those students effectively. And those might be different in a district where, you know, homelessness is concentrated in all of the schools versus a district where there are a large number of homeless students, but it's very dispersed throughout the schools. Or in some districts like in Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant, the central Brooklyn area, where you have a high concentration of homeless students, but actually the numbers, the exact numbers in the district itself are smaller because the district is a smaller district. So you need to think about how funding affects all those different situations.
So the numbers tell us some very significant things and ways of approaching the issue here. Now, one of the things in reading through your literature is ICPH makes a strong point, and you had really alluded to it a little bit earlier, that the difference between being poor and being homeless, that they're not the same thing, that there are differences between poor students and the homeless student. Can you go into that for us a little bit?
Sure. Well, one thing that we've found is looking at every single indicator, whether it's chronic absenteeism or test scores, graduation rates, dropout rates, transfers, across the board, students who were homeless during the school year were struggling more academically than students who were poor but housed, and much, much more than.
That's very important. Yeah. So if you were housed, it really did make a difference. Even if you were poor, but you were housed, that made a big difference. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
I thought that was really interesting when I read that.
It's a really important factor. One thing I think you can look at is school transfers, for example.
Okay.
Students who are homeless transferred schools at 3 times the rate of students who were housed.
And what's the danger there?
The danger there is that every single school transfer is estimated to set a student back up to 6 months academically. So these students who are transferring frequently are really at a disadvantage, and 1 out of every 4 students who is homeless transferred during school year 2013-14. So that is, when we're thinking about how to help students succeed, that is a really important educational barrier that students are experiencing.
What other barriers do they face?
Another huge barrier is chronic absenteeism. So students who are homeless in school year 2013-14, 40%, almost 40% of them were chronically absent from school. And this is compared to, it was about half the rate for students who were housed in low income, and then 3 times the rate of students who were housed but not low income. So
you've mentioned the poor academic performance. You had said earlier that these students do not score as well on the state exams. Is that true? That's true for both the English and the math? Both English and math. On English, students who are homeless were grade proficient about 13% of the time, and for math, it was about 17% of the time. And one thing that was really important, or actually really striking, was that we looked in a recent report we just released called Aftershocks, looking at the lasting impact of homelessness on education. What we found was that students who were stably housed in school year 13-14, but who had experienced homelessness at some point in the last 3 years, that those students were performing most similarly to students who are homeless. So it was their proficiency rates were almost exactly the same. So what you're saying again is that even if you can put a child in a home, the effects of that period of being homeless do not dissipate because that child is now placed into a home. Exactly. We need to think from a public policy perspective, we need to think about the uniqueness of the impact of homelessness on children, and to think about that students who are homeless and those who've experienced homelessness really might be a unique cohort of students that we need to be thinking about in terms of how do we meet their educational needs, what kind of programs are needed to support students, not just when they're homeless, but after they're housed, and how do we create a continuum of educational care. Was the aftershock effect a surprise to people who were doing this research? I think it was a surprise to the degree that we saw it. We expected that there would be, that students who'd experienced homelessness would be struggling
but we didn't expect to see them really on par with students who are currently homeless. It was also striking that this impact was above and beyond just poverty alone. So there was a small group of students who were no longer low income. So they no longer receiving free or reduced price lunch. And those students who were formerly homeless but no longer receiving free or reduced price lunch still were struggling more academically on their tests than the group of students who had always been stably housed but receiving free or reduced price lunch. I have to say that as an
educator, I'm not at all surprised. I mean, I can see this. And again, the data that you show us in terms of the aftershocks of housing instability having to do with the pass rates and the way they score on the exams are really do tell a sobering story, I think, when you just look at that information there, the number of students who pass the test and the way that they do. You mentioned again, so we have this poor academic performance, we have the transfer issue, we have the absenteeism, lower graduation rates. What other factors can affect these students? I know you've looked at English language learners. Are they more adversely affected?
Well, I would almost switch it around a little bit. One thing that we found was that there's a very high rate of English language learning needs among homeless students. And so the reason this is important is that, again, from a program development standpoint or from a service delivery perspective, knowing that many homeless students have English language learning needs can be something that we can use as a piece of information to help develop programs. So it was about 1 out of every 4 students who was experiencing homelessness in school year 2013-14 had some sort of English language learning need.
And special needs students who need IEPs?
Right, that was a very interesting piece for us, and that about 1 in 5 students who are homeless have an IEP. Now, what was more interesting for us than that, though, was that this was not distributed equally across the city. So you would think, just from a sort of a public health epidemiological standpoint, that the rate of IEPs would be roughly similar. And we found rates ranging from 11% up to 25%, depending on what school district a student was in. So it's hard to know whether or not students are being over-identified in some districts or under-identified in other districts. But what we do know is that they're not being identified at the same rate. And that is an area that's really, there's need for further exploration to find out, are we meeting the special education needs of homeless children? My guess would be no.
I would imagine the city would say that they have tried any number of approaches to addressing the homeless issue, both for adults and children. Why have our policies failed so badly in the past?
I think one really important piece is this is the first time that anyone has looked at these numbers. Effective policies need effective data to be based on. And up to now, there really hasn't been a clear understanding of just how many students are homeless, what their test outcomes are, what their struggles are in terms of chronic absenteeism.
So we've been working in the dark, trying to approach something without knowing enough about it.
Right. There are a lot of groups that have been, trying to address programs. The Students in Temporary Housing unit at the Department of Education does a great job with their programs, and they really work to address and meet the needs of homeless students. But the number of homeless students has been growing dramatically. I mean, there's a 25% growth in 4 years. And, that growth is very difficult to meet the needs without thinking about where are students.
So you've done all this research, right?
Yes.
Have you seen any of this now being put into practice? Some of what you found, are people using it to make better policies, and what are those policies that we're seing? So, if they are using it to make better policies.
What I would say is people are definitely talking about it.
Okay.
So that is the first step towards better policies, I think, that there are conversations.
What would you like to see people do, and what can we do? You've painted a pretty broad picture of a very big, serious problem. So based on the numbers, what can we do?
I think the first thing is that we need to reframe homelessness. When we talk about homelessness, most of the time people are talking about adult homelessness, single homelessness, the person they see on the street. It's very important to address the needs of single homeless individuals, but we also need to be thinking about homelessness as a children's issue. And when we think about homelessness as a children's issue, then we need to start thinking about, well, where are homeless children? And then we need to be putting programs for those children where they are, in the shelters, in the schools, in communities, you know, really building up resources in those places so that programs are reaching homeless children where they're at.
Can you think of, have there been any efforts made currently? Do you know of any programs that have been put into place? And before I forget, I must ask you, do we know about the psychological effect of homelessness? I mean, I must imagine for children that there must be a huge psychological component that goes into being homeless when other kids in the classroom are not. I mean, what do we know about that?
Well, one thing that I would say is that homelessness definitely has been identified as a form of trauma on children, for children. It's, and so I think all of the research that's out there looking at trauma and the importance of trauma-informed care for children who've experienced trauma stand for students who've experienced homelessness. Losing your house, your apartment.
For an adult, that's a trauma. I mean,
yeah,
you know.
Everyone needs to have some sort of stable place to be and a stable place to do your homework, your friends, community connections. So that, I think that is something that's being talked about a lot more, the importance of trauma-informed care in the context of working with homeless children and homeless youth.
Are teachers aware of who are the homeless children in their class?
So sometimes yes, and sometimes no.
Is there a philosophy about that? Should they know? Shouldn't they know?
Legally, they are not allowed to know unless there is, unless the student discloses it themselves.
To protect the child's privacy.
Yes.
Okay.
So the person who's the liaison at the school, who actually helps the student register, would know that they are homeless. But then after that point, it really is up to whether or not the student or the family discloses that to other people. And you know, that can be, we met with some representatives from the teachers union, and they were fabulous teachers who really were working to help their students. And they said, you know, one of the things that was really challenging for them was that often they don't know. But that is, you know, that is a challenge of the situation we're in.
So we only have a few minutes left. Excuse me. Could you tell us again, what would you like to see be done? So
I think the most important thing at the moment from the standpoint of where ICPH comes from as an organization is that we need to be using these numbers, this information, as a basis for the policies. And we need to be thinking about tracking this information so that we can actually see an impact. You know, if we don't look at what's going on with homeless students, we're never going to solve the problem. There are a lot of different people who are doing creative programs, and hopefully these numbers can be something that will help them further those programs that are going on.
I would imagine, however, you need an overall broad approach rather than a few individual approaches that are being done in various places. I mean, to address a situation such as this, you really have to have an encompassing approach. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. Has there been a reaction from the DOE as to how they could work with you or take this information and make changes in the schools? What has their reaction been?
Well, we've been working with the Students in Temporary Housing Unit a fair amount, and their reaction has been incredibly positive to this information. They have used it to present to superintendents, to principals, just to start to have that conversation again. If people aren't aware that homeless students are in their schools, they're not going to be able to develop programs for them. And I would say that while an encompassing solution, you know, an overarching solution is important, it's also important not to forget the local level. Every community, there are different situations that students are facing. And what the best solution will be will really depend on that neighborhood. So it's important for there to be community engagement and the local program development, as well as thinking about what are the overarching solutions.
Have you seen a particular program or approach that you thought was encouraging, or that, you know?
You know, I would say some of the programs that are going in the right direction, things like the community school models, service-enriched shelters. Again, those programs which are really trying to put services where homeless students are so that they're effectively reaching students.
What would you like our viewers to take away from this, and what could they possibly do to help this?
I think the first thing to take away would be that 1 out of every 9 students in New York City has experienced homelessness in a 4-year period. This is not an issue that is just an isolated, these students over there. It's a New York City issue, and we need to come together as a community of caring individuals, caring parents, and work together to help students wherever they are.
I want to commend you for really undertaking this tremendous amount of research and really calling our attention to what I think is obviously a very serious problem. So thank you for joining us today on EdCast. Jennifer Erb-Downward of the Institute for Children, Poverty and Homelessness. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. If you're marking papers right now, put down the red pen. A study at the University of Colorado finds that students react negatively to teacher comments written in red ink. This is especially true if they disagree with the comment. Marking papers in red seems similar to using all caps in writing emails or text messages. The shout tends to lower students' self-esteem. An interesting corollary is another study done in California. It shows that those teachers who pick up the red pen in the first place give lower grades than those using pens of other colors. Perhaps in response to the growing opt-out movement, New York State will stop giving timed tests to students. This is meant to alleviate some test-taking anxiety. But there is little research regarding the value of timed tests versus ones where students can go at their own pace. Some educators believe that timed tests lower student achievement. Others, such as Success Academy President Eva Moskowitz, are opposed to abandoning timed tests. Evaluating teacher performance is complicated and controversial. Teachers have resisted attempts to link their performance to student test scores. Most evaluations rely on classroom observations, but these may do teachers a disservice too. A new study shows that teachers with high-performing students tend to get better ratings. Rather than giving information about teacher effectiveness, the study finds that classroom observations may say more about the students than the teacher. The number of students enrolled in charter schools continues to grow. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools estimates that nearly 3 million students are currently attending these schools, a 6-fold increase over the last 15 years. According to the report, more than 400 charter schools opened this academic year. 270 closed for a variety of reasons, including low enrollment, lack of financial resources, and poor academic performance. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed.